I'm Sarah Kenzier, the author of the best-selling books The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the United States and rising autocracy around the world. And so, once again, Americans are still under attack. Yes, we no longer have a Kremlin asset, mobbed up, sociopath, plague fiend, and nuke fetishist as the president, but we still have his criminal backers running around free. And as we've long stated on Gaslit Nation, it's the operators behind the scenes, the oligarchs, the mafias, the blood and money-drenched right-wing fanatics who are the true source of control over the American body politic. Getting rid of Trump did not get rid of the core problems, much as his win did not create them. Elite criminal impunity remains the scourge of this country. Among the crimes that the Biden administration, the FBI, and other investigatory bodies seem content to ignore are, first, the January 6th seditious attack on the Capitol. Second, the purposeful spread of and profiteering over COVID-19 by the Trump administration and its backers. Third, the fact that a Kremlin asset and a bunch of crime lords hijacked our government with the stated intent of dismantling it. And fourth, the mass abuse of migrant children on the border by a cabal of white supremacist sadists, and so on. I can go on and on with the crimes that have seen no redress. It's the tip of the iceberg, and there is no excuse for not pursuing these criminals with urgency, both because inaction sets a dangerous precedent, but also because we simply do not have much time to act. Which brings us to the GOP's continued attack on voting rights. You may think that Biden has 4 years to fix this, but you are extremely wrong, since at this rate, it is likely that the Democrats are going to lose the House in 2022, meaning that the ability of the Democrats to pass meaningful structural reform and pursue justice expires next year. Why are the Democrats set to lose the House? Because states with GOP legislatures are rewriting the laws to determine who can vote, where they can vote, how they can vote, and even whether votes and elected officials can be overturned on their whim. There is a way to stop this Jim Crow revival, which we've mentioned many times. Kill the filibuster and pass voting rights protection, particularly the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But the Senate refuses to do it. And their refusal has put us back in the same self-destructive feedback loop that has defined Democratic politics for the past decade. Frustrated Americans are told to shut up and obey and give money in order to, quote, vote them out next time. The trouble is, there will not be a next time under the current GOP operation. Unfortunately, Democratic leaders are not fighting back assertively, but making excuses. This is an old pattern that's been particularly pernicious over the past 4 years. The first excuse was the GOP trifecta of 2017, which was actually a legitimate excuse. But their second excuse was the bullshit, we can't show any initiative because Mitch McConnell will stop us excuse, which demoralized Democratic voters in 2019 and 2020. And now, with all three branches of the federal government in their hands, the new excuse is Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who has embraced his role as the new mascot of obstructionism. So, Andrea, what are your thoughts on Joe Manchin?
Joe Manchin gaslights America. Listen to what he says. So here in an interview, I'm quoting a tweet we'll share in the show notes, as we do for every episode we post on Patreon. Amanda Turkle, reporter for HuffPost, writes, citing Manchin, saying, "The only thing I would caution anybody and everybody about is that we had an insurrection on January 6th because of voting, right? We should not at all attempt to do anything that would create more distrust and division. Joe Manchin, we got Donald Trump as president in large part because John Roberts, his Supreme Court, gutted the Voting Rights Act. So there is a sweeping epidemic against Black voters, who are, of course, predominantly Democratic voters. So none of this is normal. And to try to normalize it with your gaslighting is simply what it is. You are gaslighting the American public. None of your arguments make any sense. And they do not stand up to scrutiny of the moment at hand, the crisis that we're facing, which Sarah listed. And it doesn't stand up to the record of history. No appeasement could settle down the Nazis. The Nazis are a violent cult energized by more violence. And that violent Nazi train has left the station. That is literally what we are up against. So you trying to appease Nazis, like a modern day Chamberlain, is going to come back to haunt us all and hurt us all. And I want to just go into some of the weeds of what we're up against from this great piece. Again, we'll link to in our show notes. From Adam Gentleson in The Atlantic. You all know Adam. We had him on the show recently. He is the author of The Kill Switch, going into the long racist history of the filibuster. The U.S. Senate was never envisioned by the founding fathers to be an obstructionist body. It was never meant to be obstructionist. The obstructionism was launched by senators representing slave states trying to protect the violent, evil institution of slavery. And the filibuster became this mutant obstructionist force, always when it came to taking away the rights and stopping any progress for Black people, for people of color, even if at the time, throughout the last 200 years or so, even if at the time there was popular support for anti-lynching legislation, even though there was popular support of getting rid of a poll tax, which of course was meant to stop Black people from voting. It didn't matter because you had the proudly, openly white racist senators using the filibuster to create a veto by the minority against the majority. And it's been used increasingly in recent years. It's obstructionism by the minority party to block any progress. And it's extremely dangerous that this is still in play when we are being hit with so many crises that demand that government works and works fairly and works for everyone. So now, from Adam Gentleson's piece in The Atlantic, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, which tracks voter suppression efforts across the country, 47 states have seen 361 bills aimed at restricting voting rights since the beginning of the year. A 2018 analysis by Civics Analytics found that non-white voters are more underrepresented in the Senate than at any time since 1870. In today's Senate, evenly split at 50 seats a party, that bias toward predominantly white, small states means that Democrats represent 41 million more people than Republicans. And that will of the majority is being suppressed by the filibuster, which Joe Manchin wants to protect. Control of the White House and Senate allows Republicans who came to power on the backs of a white conservative minority to appoint judges who make it even easier for Republicans to win elections. Although conservative and liberal justices sided against former President Donald Trump's outlandish claims of election fraud, conservative judges are waging a steady, if quieter, campaign against voting rights. A recent study shows that 79% of decisions by Republican-appointed judges restrict access to the ballot versus 37% for Democratic-appointed judges. This has proved true at the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice John Roberts authored the majority opinion on the Shelby case, which gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act and capping off the career-long crusade against voting rights that John Roberts began as a political appointee in the Reagan Justice Department. Overall, judges appointed by Bush and Trump make up 48% of the judiciary. Judges appointed by Trump alone make up 28%. When these judges hear anti-democratic claims that are less absurd than Trump's, they're likely to be sympathetic. As we've always said in Gaslit Nation, the judiciaries are the cage bars of any struggling democracy. Gerrymandering at the state level also plays a crucial role in this doom loop that allows Republicans to maintain control of state legislatures, which then pass restrictive voting laws in key swing states and inflate Republicans' numbers in Congress, despite representing a minority of the populations in those states. A bipartisan panel of judges found that in North Carolina's 2018 midterm elections, Democratic candidates for the state legislature won a majority of the statewide vote, but Republicans won 54% of state House seats, and 58%, again a majority, of state Senate seats. A University of Southern California study found that Michigan, Wisconsin, Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, all states needed to win the Electoral College, all suffer from minority rule in one or both chambers of their state legislatures. These state legislatures draw the congressional district maps every 10 years and will do so in the coming months, following the results of the 2020 census, which I will add was cut short by the Trump administration and was carried out during a pandemic and carried out under Trump, who was laying out an a far-right onslaught on immigrants and undocumented people who likely would, of course, not want to be counted in a census when a government census worker comes knocking around. So the 2020 census, which is about to determine the political future of the country, was deeply flawed. So, and now back to this article. As Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report has shown, Republicans can use this upcoming round of redistricting to gerrymander away Democrats' majority in the House of Representatives before a single vote is cast in the 2022 midterm elections. Did you hear that? Democrats have already lost control of the House. This is a crisis. We are losing our democracy. Biden and Democratic leadership in Congress can protect democracy by protecting the most vulnerable. Right now, the most vulnerable in America are people of color, especially children. People of color are responsible, through their hard work and organizing, for winning the White House and Congress for the Democrats. Biden and Democratic leadership must repay them by protecting them, by treating white supremacy, state violence against Black votes, against Black bodies as an urgent crisis. There must be swift action and accountability. We're living in a time of mass trauma that's only going to get worse, especially for people of color, especially for children of color who are being taught that they're growing up in a country where their life doesn't matter, where they can expect to be hunted down and assassinated in a quote-unquote routine traffic stop. This human rights crisis is only going to get worse. The horrors escalating under Republican authoritarian control with posh Nazis like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Marjorie Taylor Greene, soon in charge of the Congress in 2022, everything is going to escalate. The violence is going to escalate. Look at how bad things are now. Then imagine how much worse they will be if we don't reform the filibuster immediately and pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act immediately, pass a big climate change legislation immediately, climate change which impacts communities of color the most, to pass meaningful legislation to confront white supremacy in all its many insidious forms, from the healthcare system to predatory financial corruption. Immediately, action, urgent, crisis, immediately. There's no time to waste. Just look at the daily trauma of headlines we're constantly assaulted with in America to show how sick and fragile democracy has become. We have yet another story of state-sanctioned murder in the middle of a high-profile case of Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd by suffocating him to death, a fact confirmed by a long list of medical experts testifying in court. As Derek Chauvin's defense tries to put the victim on trial, you have yet another assassination of a young Black man in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, 10 miles from where Floyd was killed, by a veteran police officer named Kimberly Potter, who has served on the force for 26 years, was a longtime police union president, and was in the middle of training another officer when she claimed she mistook her loaded gun for a taser when she pulled it out to shoot and kill 20-year-old Daunte Wright. Wright was pulled over for expired tags and killed It's a pandemic. Do you know how hard it is to renew anything these days? And he's 20 years old and has a toddler who's nearly 2 years old. All those factors combined, I sure as hell would be driving with expired tags if I were him. But the major difference is that I would be protected simply for my white skin color. All these casual state killings of people of color, that's not normal. It's dystopian. If this was happening in any other country, tourism would plummet. Western leaders would pass sanctions. Every latest murder adds to the state-sanctioned trauma impacting all communities of color who have to raise their children under the constant threat of white supremacy violence. Dante Wright's little boy is going to celebrate his second birthday without his father and grow up in a society that could one day hunt him down and kill him too. Police forces in America were created to hunt down enslaved people who risked their lives to escape to freedom. America's long history of genocide of Black people and Native Americans, hunting and killing people of color, has been so normalized it keeps happening, and this long, hateful legacy tried to violently overturn our democracy on January 6th and is acting like it's entitled to get away with it. What's worse is that the climate crisis is going to impact these communities of color the hardest, compacting this trauma, letting rising sea levels threaten and eventually flood the homes. And what's going to happen is we're going to neglect the countless climate refugees because they're people of color. And that's going to be a story we're going to be forced to live with every day, just like this dystopian state murders of Black men and women. None of this is normal. People of color brought Democrats to power with the clear understanding their lives would be protected, that their children's lives would one day be spared this trauma. Joe Biden must act with urgency to get his party in line and pass filibuster reform, pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, pass sweeping human rights legislation to end state violence against communities of color in all its many insidious forms. Biden and Democrats must act with everyday urgency with the little time they have left, because by the time the 2022 election is over, it will be too late. White supremacy has already laid the groundwork to steal the 2022 election from you. And once they do, we may never get our democracy back, not without a generation or two of martyrs sacrificing their lives and freedom, like the people are doing right now in Belarus, in Ukraine, and in Russia. And those generations in America will look back on Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer as those who could have done more when they had the chance, but failed to treat the decline of our democracy as an urgent crisis.
Yes, absolutely. This is a time where we need resolute moral leadership. And this is a time when time is running out, as we keep emphasizing again and again. And that's not to panic you, that's to motivate you, to contact your representatives, to drill everything that Andrea just pointed out into their heads, because this is the future we're looking at. And we are at a turning point. And within this turning point, you cannot have one individual like Joe Manchin be, the node upon which democracy or autocracy triumphs. Like, it's absolutely absurd. It's absurd that it's not called out more. It's absurd that he's not investigated more as to what exactly is motivating his behavior. And I think it's because people don't want to see this as a crisis, because we've just endured so many crises, some of which seem to be fading. But as I, pointed out in a previous episode, they really just went underground. That's true of the Trump crime cult and all its backers. With COVID, you actually are seeing improvement. We do have vaccines. We're seeing, the numbers of deaths and sick people go down. And I think a lot of people just want to look the other way and assume things are going to be all right. But that's exactly how we got in this position. And that certainly applies also to racist police brutality and to systemic racism that Andrea was just describing. This idea that somehow progress just moves along on its own without people pushing it, without people bending the arc forcibly toward justice, because it doesn't move on its own. And so it's absolutely essential that we examine these people who are obstacles to that and who are denying people their rights and denying people their freedom. And, Manchin is a weird one because he seems just so vacuous. He's like, an enigma wrapped in a riddle, wrapped in a lot of money. So I'm just going to kind of go into, who is Joe Manchin and what is his guiding philosophy?
And journalists need to be digging into Joe Manchin.
They do. I dug, man, and it's a road to hell. But anyway.
Yeah, exactly right.
So I'm gonna bring you down this road to hell because I started nosing around, and I found a bunch of weird shit. So I'll start with this one. So what is Manchin doing there? Like, why is he in the Senate? Why does he want this job? So in 2017, he was asked to leave Schumer's leadership team just due to lackluster behavior. And when he was asked to leave, he responded, and I am quoting him directly. This is from the West Virginia Record. I don't give a shit. You understand? I just don't give a shit. I don't care if I get elected. I don't care if I get defeated. How about that? Well, yeah, how about that? So Joe Manchin is a person who, by his own admission, does not care about his job. Getting elected is not the point. Governing is not the point. This is probably why he continues to oppose the filibuster, which would allow voting rights laws to be enacted, even though the lack of voting rights laws would almost certainly cost him his Senate seat. This is a self-defeating thing that he's doing in opposing the filibuster.
It sure as hell is going to end any chance of Democratic control of either chamber, for sure, if they don't.
Yeah. And his little party of being like the big important guy, is going to end because he'll just be out completely. But he doesn't seem to care, not about his country, not about his role in leading it. So what is Joe Manchin interested in besides money? He likes to define himself as a true centrist, but it is impossible to be a, quote, centrist when the other party is an authoritarian cult. You are merely a cult enabler, one far more to the right than you present yourself as being. Manchin was one of few Democrats to vote in some of Trump's most destructive nominees, including Jeff Sessions, Bill Barr, Steve Mnuchin, Mike Pompeo, Rex Tillerson, David Freeman, that's Trump's personal bankruptcy lawyer who was made the ambassador to Israel. Manchin was only one of 2 Democrats who voted for that guy. Rick Perry, and I can go on and on, but it's probably easier to just list who Joe Manchin vetoed, which was Betsy DeVos, Mick Mulvaney, and Wilbur Ross. And honestly, I'm not sure why he vetoed Wilbur Ross. He was kind of an exception there. Most Democrats foolishly let that corporate raider turned plague profiteer be the Commerce Secretary. So I don't know if Manchin just checked the wrong box or something, but I guess credit where credit is due. Good job on vetoing Wilbur Ross, Joe Manchin. This shows you can do it. It's too bad you went ahead and backed Brett Kavanaugh right after. So anyway, that's just his official role. What he was kind of doing behind the scenes gets worse. Joe Manchin liked doing shady shit with the Trump crime cult. He was a welcomed guest at dinners with Ivanka and Jared. But most concerningly, he was a backer of one of Jared Kushner's earliest plots, a plot that took place even before Trump was inaugurated. This is the plot that got Michael Flynn in so much trouble and played a prominent role in the Mueller probe. We've gone over this a million times, but to recap, in late December 2016, Michael Flynn contacted Russian ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak, and asked Russia to veto a UN security resolution condemning Israel's settlements in the West Bank. He then lied to the FBI about this illegal act. Kushner was doing the same thing as well, applying the same kind of pressure. Russian ambassador to the UN, Vitaly Churkin, was one of the few direct witnesses to their actions. But by February 2017, Flynn was out of office as Trump's national security advisor and put under federal investigation, while Churkin died under mysterious circumstances 1 week later, with the cause of death still sealed. So you can go listen to the archives for more on that. So anyway, you might be like, well, what does Joe Manchin have to do with any of that? So while most Democrats were supporting Obama, who was still the president then, and who did not want this resolution vetoed, Manchin went rogue and supported Kushner, Flynn, and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, a longtime Trump and Kushner confidant. Manchin released a statement saying, I urge the Obama administration to veto the UN resolution demanding an end to Israeli settlement building. I support two-party negotiations to reach agreement on any settlement issues, and this UN resolution is not the way to pursue, he wrote peach, but it's actually peace, so way to go, Joe Manchin, to pursue peace.
That's a Freudian slip about Trump.
Yeah.
That's who's on his mind. That's who he's serving.
Yeah, exactly. Big Orange. Joe Manchin works for Big Orange, or Big Peach, I should say. Not the way to pursue peach between the Palestinian Authority and the state of Israel. Notably, Manchin was joined in this effort by Chuck Schumer. Those were the two Democrats who were backing this. So if you're wondering why Schumer has been so soft on Manchin's obstructionism, that may be a place to look. And then we have more strange things going on with Manchin in the Middle East. Manchin was one of only four Democratic senators, I believe, to vote against the 2015 Iran deal. And he was one of the co-authors of the anti-BDS bill, which punishes US companies that participate in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israeli human rights violations. This is an action that is reminiscent of the GOP's current outrage over corporations speaking up about civil rights in the US right now. Manchin has repeatedly claimed that Israel is the US's best ally, but he also seems fond of other states with autocratic regimes. One of those autocrats is Bashar al-Assad of Syria. In 2013, Manchin doubted that Assad used chemical weapons, saying there is no doubt that an attack occurred and there is no doubt that it was produced under the Assad regime. It's not clear-cut if Assad gave the order himself. This has not been proven. In 2014, he voted against funding Syrians who were fighting Assad and called Republicans insane for doing so. But before you go labeling him some sort of peacenik, this all changed when Trump was elected, and Trump decided he wanted to bomb Syria, which was an action that Manchin ardently supported. So while it may seem he's just all over the place, he's actually very consistent when it comes to supporting Trump-Kushner destructive Middle East foreign policy. On that note, he also voted against a Senate resolution disapproving of arms sales to Saudi Arabia, thereby ensuring its failure and benefiting the brutal regime of MBS, who is yet another Trump-Kushner confidant. So this leads to the question, like, is he compromised? Is he, in league with these crime cult folks? I mean, I don't know, and I'm not claiming that because I don't think that there's enough evidence to claim that. And, it could be donor money. It could be a personality thing. It's very hard to tell. I wasn't kidding when I said he was enigmatic. But I do think there needs to be more investigation because, this stuff is all out there and very few people seem to be trying to get into the why. It's more the whether that they focus on, like, will he do this? Will he do that? Well, look into his record and try to figure out why he made these other baffling decisions. As he said, it's not for his own election. He doesn't care if he wins or loses. It's not for West Virginia. They don't care about these issues versus things like jobs or broadband or, roads and infrastructure. It's weird. I don't know. Andrea, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's not surprising at all that Joe Manchin is lockstep with Trump, Ivanka, and Kushner. He's one of them. And the fact that he's through his votes supporting these mass murdering dictators that are part of the axes of power, which Putin is very much a part of. Putin is a far-right leader. Under Putinism, there have been open attacks on immigrants. It's a xenophobic mass murdering terrorist regime that Putinism has created and launched against the world. And as part of that axis of power, there's Netanyahu, a close Putin ally. There's Trump, a close Putin ally. There's Assad, a close Putin ally. And if Manchin, with his votes, is essentially supporting these people, and even being schizophrenic as you mentioned, like he has it in him to vote down some of these crooks, right? But just a lot of the outlier votes are extraordinarily troubling, and they're red flags. And I don't think Manchin is ever going to budge. I think his whole purpose is to wait out the clock until 2022 under this gaslighting campaign of being bipartisan. And that way nothing gets done. And his cronies, his fellow warriors of whiteness, this corruption, that culture that he lives and breathes of all these weird connections, they're going to be back in power and they're going to thrive. And the Republicans are on a roll. They're building off of all their successes. So once they get back in power in Congress in 2022, they're going to be laying the groundwork to steal the White House in 2024. It's just going to keep building on itself. And a lot of the horrors that we're living with today are going to be normalized. We're going to be up against other horrors. I mean, there's a video right now of NYPD officers with a robotic dog that has been the focus of Black Mirror episodes. Black Mirror is a futuristic dystopian nightmare TV series, and they full on had these same robotic dogs. They showed one hunting down a woman in this barren landscape. NYPD has robotic dogs. So what we're telling you is that these are the good old days and that we need to fight like hell now to protect our future before things get really, really dark. And they will get very, very dark if Democratic leadership doesn't yank Joe Manchin in line for the literal sake of humanity. And I want to point out that, like, on top of all this, Joe Manchin is a living embodiment of what we say that white supremacy endangers all of us. He is a living, breathing monument to neo-Confederacy by blocking filibuster reform. The filibuster, as I mentioned earlier, has that long tradition of specifically being abused and being turned into this weapon to stop progress for civil rights. And that is what he's doing right now. And he's part of that long tradition. And I want to just go back to Adam Gentelson's great piece in The Atlantic, where he shows the stakes he goes into this. I'm going to read it now. President Joe Biden came into office facing 4 converging crises: COVID-19, climate change, racial justice, and the economy. But after a few weeks of fast action on a pandemic relief plan, a 5th crisis will determine the fate of the rest of his administration, and perhaps that of American democracy itself: the minority rule doom loop, by which predominantly white conservatives gain more and more power, even as they represent fewer Americans. The doom loop consists of 4 interlocking components: candidates who represent white conservatives, Republicans, in our ideologically sorted era, begin every election cycle buoyed by voter suppression and gerrymandering, what I call electoral warfare, which makes it easier for them to win. Then, anti-democratic features of the American system that have always existed but never benefited one party over the other in any systematic way help those same candidates take control of institutions such as the White House and the Senate, despite winning fewer votes and representing fewer people than their opponents. Once in control of these institutions, these newly elected officials use them to entrench their power beyond the reach of voters. If they are eventually voted out of power, they retain a veto over the agenda of the majority, which they use to block change and feed the conservative case that the government is broken. This hastens their return to power along the very path they greased with voter suppression. The net effect of this doom loop is a growing divergence between the agenda of the government and the will of the governed, an untenable dynamic in any democracy. With Democratic control of Congress hanging by a handful of seats, the next 2 years might be the country's last chance to stop this cycle.
There's one more thing I want to add to that, which is that one thing some Democrats have been proposing, given the obstinacy of both Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema to get rid of the filibuster completely, is to make an exception where they would get rid of it to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and protect voting rights. And so obviously this is, not the greatest solution, since you're still left with all of the other things that the filibuster prevents from getting done, but it handles the most critical problem. Because if we do not have voting rights, if the type of, policies that are being passed, these Jim Crow policies in states like Georgia, become more widespread, as they're going to do over the next couple of years, then we are in a doom loop. We are going straight down. And this is the time to fix it. Like, you don't get to choose your time. I know people want to like kick back and relax, and that probably includes members of Congress, but like, you can't, if you do that now, you will never be able to do it again. Like, this is when you buckle down and you secure the future and you start digging us out of this hellhole that we've been in, particularly in the last 4 years, but, to some extent, the last 40 years since Reaganomics kicked off, and to a large extent since the founding of our country on genocide and slavery. Like, this is your time to try to turn things around in terms of these structural, malevolent systems that have existed. And I mean, if they don't, it's like what I see happening, honestly, it parallels, we've discussed this on other shows, it parallels the fall of the former Soviet Union, where institutions are so profoundly weak, where you have a gerontocracy at the top that is unable to respond to urgent deteriorating conditions, when you have a populace that is broken up and, disheartened. And I don't want to make too much of an analogy because the Soviet Union was an empire. It's an empire that forced other countries, independent nations like Estonia, Lithuania, all of the Central Asian states. It drew those state boundaries, encouraged nationalism within them, but then folded them into Sovietsky Narod, into the Soviet, the quote unquote Soviet people. It's a different story in many ways than that of the United States. But, you see these secessionist movements rising up in California for liberals, in Texas for conservatives. You see foreign backers, especially in Russia, pushing them. You see a number of people falling into this trap that somehow this will create, a more equitable solution. And it's insane. I mean, I've been into this. I've discussed this so many goddamn times on this show, how there are not red and blue states, how there are not neat demarcations, how if there is a partitioning of the United States, once again, the most weak and vulnerable people will suffer. The poor will suffer. Communities of color will suffer. The people who are suffering already will suffer more, and oligarchs and plutocrats will go in, take advantage of the chaos, and reap a whirlwind of profits while continuing to chip away at rights and freedoms. Like, there will be no paradise partition republic within a broken up United States. And also, just on a personal level, the idea of this breaks my heart. Like, I'm an American, this is my home. This is, for many of our listeners, this is your home. Like, I can't, the idea of envisioning this is, it taps into something very emotional for me, like very painful for me. And I see it coming around the bend, and I see our opportunities to stop it dead in its tracks. And I hope that people understand the urgency of this moment and do everything that they can, because while this may not happen immediately, it's the direction we're going over the next decade. And I can already see the people who are in line to profit off of this. They're the exact same elites who are not being prosecuted for the multitude of crimes that they've been committing around the world. People like Paul Manafort, people like Roger Stone, many of them have already been indicted and pardoned. This is a crime cult. This is transnational organized crime, posing as governments, posing as corporations, enmeshed within them. Just go look at the archives. We've been down this road many times, but every month that goes by without even an acknowledgement that this is happening or that this could potentially happen is deeply unnerving to me. Because if January 6th didn't bring it home, if Trump allowing and wanting over 500,000 Americans to die of COVID didn't bring it home, I don't know what can bring it home to these people. And I'm left to think, well, maybe some of them want it too. Maybe it's not just the Republicans. Maybe there's, the Vichy Democrats in the fold. Because I don't know how you can not see it. It's just clear as day to me. But anyway.
It comes down to, how do I say it? So just to summarize, Joe Manchin is gaslighting America. Anybody who would sacrifice our democracy at this critical time by being obstructionist to his own party, to the tens of millions of people that worked so incredibly hard to bring his party into power, anybody who has that in him has something to hide. So investigate the hell out of him, expose him for who he is. And I'm not even confident a guy like that can be bought off, because he will always be demanding more. There's greed in this obstructionism. There's greed. He's doing it for his own self-interest. And and the good moments in America's history, the moments when we've moved forward as a nation and finally achieved some human rights, some progress, were when people were willing to sacrifice their own self-interest. Joe Manchin refuses to do that now. And don't buy any argument he's trying to sell to justify his excuse. It's all classic gaslighting.
Yep. All right. So to switch gears, we've had a number of notable developments with Russia, and I created a list of them last night. But I want to start this out by saying, as you probably know by now, Biden today had a phone call with Vladimir Putin, and they put out a little summary of that call. And I was absolutely astounded to see this because I'm just not used to it. I'm used to like little covert behind the scenes meetings, in Helsinki. I'm used to a Kremlin assets obsequious bowing down to Putin, to a veil of secrecy. Biden spoke with Putin. It says they talked about cyber intrusions and election interference, about Ukraine, about the military buildup. It says he called on Russia to de-escalate tensions. He reaffirmed his goal of building a stable and predictable relationship with Russia, consistent with U.S. interests, and proposed a summit meeting in a third country in the coming months to discuss the full range of issues facing the United States and Russia. So kind of like a milquetoast statement, which is to be expected. What I would like to see is Biden addressing the American people about Russia and what Russia did in the election, and about the massive, unprecedented cyber attack that is going on still from Russia on the United States that was launched in 2020. And then there's some other stuff that I would definitely like the Biden administration to weigh in on, because it's been quite a lively few months. So these are some dangerous things that Russia has been up to recently. I will start with the nuclear torpedo. So Russia is planning to deploy a nuclear-powered missile to the Arctic next summer that is designed to detonate off the coastlines of enemy countries. That is according to CNN. One of those countries is the United States, and the nuclear tsunami is expected to hit the East Coast. Russia, in addition to creating a nuclear tsunami, is fine melting the Arctic in order to carry out this initiative. So you've got two existential threats to the world from Russia of nuclear war and accelerated climate change going on at once. Second, we have a potential acceleration of the war in Ukraine. Tens of thousands of Russian troops have amassed on the Ukraine border. These are the largest numbers of troops since Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. The Kremlin is not hiding this in any way. On Monday, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov called the United States our adversary. They are warning of war. They've spread footage of their military buildup all over social media. They sent warships to intimidate Ukraine from its coasts. And so Biden today vowed to protect Ukraine, but the situation is extremely volatile. Then you have Alexei Navalny. He is a Russian dissident, slowly starving to death in a hunger strike in a Russian prison and being denied medical care. Kremlin critic Bill Browder, known for spurring the Magnitsky Act, the sanctions on Russian oligarchs, has called for new sanctions on Russia, saying, and I quote, "The Kremlin is killing Navalny. He may not die next week or next month, but they will grind him down until his health deteriorates and make up an excuse about how he died." Browder then said he wants the sanctions to be on the corrupt officials who Navalny singled out before his arrest. He says, Navalny made a list of who needs to be sanctioned, and it was full of people who are not working for the Russian government, but are the cashiers, the business people who look after the funds of Putin and his cronies. The US should go down that list and sanction more people and keep doing it until they release Navalny. That is the way to stop Putin from killing him. Makes sense to me. The fourth thing is the cyber attack, which I guess Biden briefly mentioned today. I don't know quite how that conversation goes with Putin, but it's probably better than what Trump did, which was asking Putin to join a cyber alliance team with Rudy Giuliani. So I guess, we've gone up in quality here. I want to go into the horrible thing that the Biden administration is rumored to be doing in terms of their hire for the Russian director of the National Security Council. But did you have thoughts on the nuclear torpedo or other things?
Oh, I always have thoughts on the nuclear torpedo that keeps me up at night. I mean, if you look at the end game of what Republicans want and the real heart of Russia Gate, it's our idiots aligned with their idiots. All the authoritarian experts that we elevate on this show and the research we share on authoritarianism, it's just idiots in power running amok and making things worse and being destructive. The Nazis get this reputation of being so organized. They kept really good records of all the people they mass murdered, but that was a chaotic regime where they were just pillaging the state and creating their own little, like Hitler's lieutenants or creating their own little fiefdoms. That's the story of autocracy. It's just destruction and chaos. And so if you look at Russia, that's what's going to happen to the US, the idiots in power making things worse. Trump on steroids if we don't stop this.
With a nuclear torpedo.
Yeah, with a nuclear torpedo. And we'll get our own nuclear torpedo, and President Matt Gaetz will have fun leveraging it to show with his friend Joel Greenberg. It's going to be nuts. But the way to stabilize foreign policy today and combat Putin's political warfare, which he is a genius of, because the Russian military is trash. It's a broken military. The US in a military fight would decimate the Russian military. But the Russians defeat the US when it comes to asymmetrical warfare. And you know that because they won a big one by getting their asset, elected president, who then furthered all this corruption and failed to stop a pandemic that killed several hundreds of thousands of people, more than the number of Americans killed in total in World War II. So that's a big win for Putin. That's something we're going to be living with for a very long time to come. And it's a deep shame that our leaders in both parties don't join together to talk more openly about that and be more forthcoming with the American people about that. And if you want to secure our democracy, it comes down to stabilizing the economy, ending the pandemic, bringing people out of poverty, showing their lives being transformed. And that's why the infrastructure bill is so essential. That's why protecting voting rights to ensure that, passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, ending gerrymandering, all these things will end political stability, will end the economic depression, which are two major factors that allow authoritarianism to thrive. So that's why Biden needs to have his party in line to pass his agenda. And that's why Joe Manchin is not just a threat to us here at home. He's a threat to our national security by being an obstructionist. And the policies that Biden would be able to pass would benefit his own constituents in West Virginia, which rank last in all sorts of categories for quality of life. So I just want to emphasize that in the 21st century, domestic policy is foreign policy. And if we're headed towards autocracy, that's great for Putin. If we're headed towards a stronger, thriving democracy, that's horrible for Putin, because Putin needs to show that that they fail. And he needs to add to his dictator club, which he could wield against the democratic world. So that's my point on the nuclear tornado, what I think of it, the torpedo.
Yeah. And that's why it's also, in addition to Congress getting in line, the Democratic Party, in the House and Senate getting in line, we need the absolute best, most trustworthy people.
The best and brightest, most empathetic and wise. And we're not going to get that.
Yeah. Well, especially to be handling Russia, handling the relationship between the US and Russia in an honest, transparent way, and one that calls for full accountability for Russia's various attacks on the United States, often in conjunction with Americans, who are traitorous, who are corrupt, and so forth. This is something many Americans, especially in the GOP, participated in willingly, and there needs to be accountability for that as well. But, we need a straight shooter. And unfortunately, instead of that, rumor has it that Matthew Rajansky, who is currently the head of the Wilson Center's Kennett Institute, is Biden's pick to be the Russia director of his National Security Council. And the reason this is of great concern is that Rajansky is a guy who basically took orders from Paul Manafort back in 2013. This was revealed by the Mueller investigation. In his report, Mueller cites a 2013 email that Manafort wrote. And I'm going to quote Manafort here. He says, "This week, we directed the efforts of a number of positive news articles that appeared in several prominent publications." This is when Manafort was in Ukraine doing dirty deeds for the Kremlin-affiliated Ukrainian government. And one of those articles was a CNN op-ed by Matthew Rajansky, who painted Yanukovych as a noble reformer. And so this is part of a broader pattern, reputation he has for being soft on the Kremlin, including dismissing the idea in 2017 that Trump had any illicit relationship with Russia. In 2020, Rajansky opposed sanctioning Russia for helping the Taliban kill US soldiers. In 2012, he suggested ending pro-democracy programs in Russia that were not approved by Putin himself. This goes on, and that this is the guy being considered, when there are so many alternatives, different people who are qualified to take on this role, has outraged experts on Russia, some of whom believe that Rajansky may be on the Kremlin payroll. For example, Garry Kasparov, the known chess player and dissident and writer, tweeted, "If Rajansky goes to work for the White House on Russia, would he keep his Kremlin salary too?" Anders Osland, an economist who focuses on Russia, tweeted, "Rajansky is the most purchasable person in DC, which says a lot. Nobody needs him for any purpose." And obviously, it is necessary to have more details about these allegations. I'm not making any claim that he is on the Kremlin payroll, but I am making a claim that he seems uniquely unqualified for this moment, given that he worked with Paul Manafort at the height of Paul Manafort's criminal power and never divulged that information, even when he was writing about Manafort in a 2016 op-ed about the Trump and Clinton campaigns. That says a lot. His continual stance towards Russia, which is appeasement under the guise of wanting there to be peace. I mean, we all want peace. We do not want military action with Russia. We do not want nuclear torpedoes flying back and forth. We want sanctions on oligarchs. We want sanctions on the people who fund these brutal policies. That is where you hit them. You hit them in the wallet. You don't hit them with troops and bombs. And we want the truth. We want real investigations, not the bullshit that we've been handed by Mueller or Comey or the FBI, which of course, has had its previous heads go on and work for the Russian mafia. We want the straightforward truth about how much danger we're in, what is going on with our elections, what is going on with cybersecurity, what exactly is going to happen with Ukraine and Russia. We need the most qualified, empathetic, and sensible, straight shooting people in charge of this division. That is not Matthew Rajansky. And I'm wondering, well, why would he even be nominated? And this kind of brings us back to, we did a special on this when Biden had his transition team, and he had Christian Ferry on it, who is another Kremlin lackey, worked with dirty Republicans, worked for Russian interests. And we were baffled about that. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if you want to reward Putin for all the mass murder he's committed in Ukraine, in Syria, in propping up the dictator of Venezuela who's starving his people, against the U.S. by bringing Trump to power, then Matthew Rajansky is a great way to do it. Putin would be thrilled, and it would just further Putin's aims. To elevate a guy like Matthew Rajansky would be an invitation to Putin to come on in, let your spies, your cutouts, your assets come on in and flourish and do their thing. Like, this guy just comes across as with no moral compass. He's just the worst of the think tank circle jerk of Washington, D.C. I looked up his name in my email to see if we ever crossed paths, and what came up were emails over several years of Ukraine watchers and Russia watchers who I deeply trust complaining about him and like his latest bad take in the media. trying to essentially both sides the Ukraine crisis with Putin and trying to say, like, let's, no accountability for Putin and his violence and his mass murder. The thing that people have to understand, when you try to stand up to Putin and you say, like, there needs to be some accountability, he needs to be contained, people immediately think that you're a warmonger. And Putin himself plays on that narrative and pushes that narrative. And Matthew Rogensky types try to say, oh, we're realists. Putin's not going to go away. We have to do business with them. What they're basically saying is, let's all get rich. Let's profit off of Putin's blood money. And if you start taking that drug, it's a dangerous gateway drug that leads to a greater entrenchment of Putin-driven corruption in your country. Like, look at Londongrad, for instance, and look at all the influence that Russian oligarchs wield in the UK, for example, in Russia's connections to helping tip the Brexit vote. So Deripaska, for instance, like an all-out oligarch thug that won the aluminum wars, he was a welcomed character in the UK where he couldn't step foot in the US. He was a persona non grata in the US. And then under Trump, he gets an entryway through McConnell by investing in this aluminum plant in Kentucky. So Matthew Rogensky is a big welcome mat for Russian oligarchy and their weaponized corruption and their golden handcuffs and buying politicians. And America is just too fragile right now to afford to have Matthew Rogensky in such a position of power. He should stay in his, self-indulgence think tank sauna rooms, hearing himself talk. He should be a think tank lifer and not allowed out of the box. Instead, they should decolonize foreign policy and put somebody in that position who empathetically and deeply understands the crisis and knows how to stand up to it. Like any Ukrainian American, like an Alexander Vindman who risked his career to call out Trump. His testimony became the base of the Trump impeachment trial, and he suffered greatly for that with all the far-right attacks against him. My sister, Alexandra Chalupa, who risked her life and her career in 2016 to alert both Democrats and Republicans about Trump and Manafort being a Kremlin Trojan horse. People thought she was crazy. No one was listening to her. She was vindicated, and they punished her relentlessly for it with ongoing threats to her and her family and making her a focus of Trump's impeachment trial. Make either of those people, elevate those voices. Elevate the voices that represent the communities that are most understand on a very deeply personal level how effective Kremlin aggression is. Decolonize foreign policy. Don't have another wanker who looks at the globe like a chessboard and a country like Ukraine just as another pawn, so entrenched in that Kissinger mindset of Ukraine just being a buffer state and it's all about the great powers. No, look at it from a human rights point of view. I just think the fact that he's even being considered is extremely troubling. And I would like to see somebody in that post who has more of a personal connection to Ukraine, because we should listen to the Ukrainian American community because they've been closely following Kremlin aggression. And Ukraine is one of the few countries that has effectively stood up to Kremlin aggression, both the political warfare and the very real hot warfare that's killing thousands of lives in the East and right now holding Crimea as a prison. And we do not need any more of this self-serving careerism of the think tank world polluting our foreign policy. Those guys need to be sidelined now. They could write their books. They could blurb each other's books. They could remain cloistered in their little ivory tower where they're happiest, I think. But for the real world solutions, the pragmatic solutions, outthinking your enemy 3 steps ahead, you need somebody who respects Ukraine, who's deeply connected to that country in some way, and that could bring in the lessons of Ukraine and harness that energy in a productive, empathetic, human rights first way.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage you to donate to your local food bank, which is experiencing a spike in demand.
We also encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Syria. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org and research ways on how you can cut out palm oil in your life. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going. And you can also subscribe to us on YouTube.
Our production managers are Nicholas Torres and Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher. Pat,
Kenny Main,
John Schoenthaler,
Frank Jacquette,
Kenneth Reed,
Ellen McGirt,
Joel Farron,
Larry Gasson,
Erica Moore,
Karen A. Deal,
Nico Phillips,
Brian E. Castor,
Lex Reed,
Andrea Scalzo,
could be Andrea,
could be,
Melissa Howland, Karen
Heisler,
Jordan Sanders,
Ann Bertino,
Rachel Winder,
T.R. Dunstan,
Kim,
John Millett,
Michael Finn,
David East,
Shannon Nacy,
Ida,
Chris Fellow,
Dodie Pop,
Kristen Bredimus,
Gabrielle R.,
Ben Wheaton,
Joseph Mara Jr.,
Amy Timon,
Rich Holcomb,
Sean McDonald,
Jeremy Thompson,
Thomas Scheibe,
Kelsey Malsum,
Julie Matthews,
Meganopolis,
Mark,
Matthew Womack,
Brittany Keener,
Sean Berg,
Kristen Custer,
Tracy Ash,
Benjamin Galuza,
Kai Gillis,
Sharon Hattrick,
Irv Robinson,
Keith Gottschalk,
William Barry Reeves,
Janet Robinson,
John Atrisk. Sorry, John Atrisk.
it's spring. We've got spring fever. Richard Smith,
Kevin Gannon,
Sandra Culnins,
Sorry, singing the names. Katie Masouras,
John Laughlin,
Jeff Thompson,
James D. Leonard,
Evan Rosemore,
Chip Salzenberg,
Leo Chalupa,
the definition of spring fever himself, Carol Golstad,
I'm sorry, everyone. Michael Wooldridge,
Greg Kreimer,
Jason Benke,
Marcus J. Trent,
Joe Darcy,
Ann Marshall,
Jeremy Lewis,
Trigve,
Christine M.,
D.L. Singfield,
Matt Perez,
Nicole Spear,
Kelly Ranson,
Brian Juden,
The Great Debate. I think he told us once. He told us on Twitter. I think it's Juden. So the J. Gustav Halsby. Of course, that's next. So sorry.
So much.
Gustav Halsby.
Christy Vitale,
Maureen Murphy.
Michelle Dash,
Jens
Alstrup
Alstrup.
Rasmussen,
Zachary Levin.
Dorothy Kamerick,
Victoria Olson.
Alabama,
Henrik Bremius.
ZW,
Lisa LaFlame.
Jason Bainbridge,
Catherine Anderson Carina.
Sarah Gray,
Lawrence Graham.
Mike Tripico,
Diana Gallagher.
John Ripley,
Ethan Mann.
Jennifer Slavic,
Rhonda White.
Piet Yitzma,
David Porter.
Kate Cotton,
Kim Mellon.
Leah Campbell,
Lorraine W. Todd.
Lynn Schneider,
Jared Lombardo.
Karen Humphreys,
Giles Boquet.
Ann Marshall,
Irina Guardia.
Eric Kaplan,
Sonia Bogdanovich.
Pam Paris.
Tanya Chalupa.
Thank you all for your support. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.